I've lived in the town of Kinsdale all my life. Born and raised, I know every nook and cranny, every store and spot. Hell, I know my neighbors better than I'd like to. Whole damn town probably knows my business more than I do. But Kinsdale ain't Detroit or anything like that, nope. You know what you're up against here, for better or worse. Or so I thought. Now the thing you need to know about Kinsdale is that it's one of those older towns. The ones that never seem to update or renovate. Almost like it's stuck in some kind of time warp. Old-timers love to weave tales about the past and whisper about the strange happenings they've seen in their days. I always figured they were yanking my chain, the lot of them. But all that changed on one fateful night. My buddy Russell had a habit of frequenting the woods near my house. It's not that he didn't have a life or anything. It's just where the man felt the most alive. Hunting, fishing, camping, you name it, and Russell's done it. From most angles, he was just your average country boy, which is why, when he got spooked over something, I figured I should listen. You know, he said to me one day, what I saw out there gave me the heebie-jeebies. My curiosity piqued. What was it? A bear? Russell just shook his head. Bears don't walk on two legs, Owen. You know that. I didn't know what to make of that, but Russell insisted that we get ready for camping that very night. As soon as I got off from my shift at the diner, we had our bags packed and hopped in my beat-up Chevy. The moment we set foot in those woods, I could feel something wasn't right. You might think I'm crazy, but it felt like something, or someone, was watching us. We trudged on, ignoring the increasingly unsettling atmosphere and making our way deeper into the woods. By the time we found our camp spot, the sun had just about set, and we were left with only the light of our campfire. What do you think's out there? I asked Russell, my voice wavering. That's what we're here to find out, right? He replied, his eyes locked on the darkness of the woods. After an hour, or maybe a bit longer, who can keep track? We heard something moving in the brush not too far from our campsite. Our eyes met, and I reckon we both knew it was that thing Russell had seen. Russell shot up, his flashlight in hand, the beam piercing through the pitch-black night like a bullet. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. What we saw was the vilest, ugliest critter I've ever laid eyes on. It was tall, easily 7 feet, and covered in a thick, mangy fur. But the weirdest part was the way it walked, like it couldn't quite decide if it wanted to be a man or a beast. Its eyes glowed an eerie red, like embers. It was just kind of standing there, gnarled hands hanging at its side, its gaze fixated on us. Now, I've had my fair share of tense situations in my life, but none quite like this. The air around us seemed to be choking with fear, a heaviness I haven't felt since. Russell broke the silence. Owen, get your gun! My revolver was in my tent, a considerable distance away, considering what we were facing, but I moved quickly, grabbing the gun and making my way back to Russell's side. As soon as the thing saw me brandishing the weapon, it bolted, unfolding from its awkward stance and dashing on 2 legs into the dark with a burst of supernatural speed. Gone. We didn't sleep that night. We just sat there with our backs against a tree, staring at where the creature had been. The woods weren't safe anymore, and we knew it. Rumors started to spread about the strange howls and growls permeating the night and the unsettling presence it brought. Word spread and reached the ears of out-of-towners, paranormal researchers, and enthusiasts who started poking around. We tried to warn them, but it ain't easy, especially when they've never seen the creature themselves. Story 2. I've never been much of a believer in the supernatural. Sure, I've listened to my fair share of campfire stories and urban legends, but no amount of pleading from my friends could make me believe that things were going bump in the night. At least, not until that fateful day. It was midsummer, and I had taken a week off from work to visit some family in a remote part of the country. We'd always been close, so it was only natural that I would eventually discover a few strange stories about the surrounding wilderness when we'd get to talking after a game of cards. My great-uncle Lou, the oldest and arguably the wisest of our little group, was the one who first told me the tale. You see, it seemed everyone had their own local cryptid. Be it man, woman, or child, everyone in the valley had at some point come face to face with a beast of immense size and ferocity. It eventually occurred to me that everyone, but me. That fact alone was enough for me to want to know more. Lou told me, in the raspy voice that comes with age, You know, I seen it once. When I was just a young buck, I was hunting deer just north of our property. I spied a monster of a buck and took a shot at it. That's when I saw it. He described the creature as something between a bear and a wolf, but with human eyes. Its fur was as black as night, and its eyes burned red like hot coals. It stared me down for what felt like an eternity before I could regain my senses enough to flee, he said in a quiet voice. Lou's story was interesting, but I was more so intrigued with wanting to uncover what kind of odd wildlife was responsible for such a tale. I figured there must be some kind of bear or large dog that had taken up residence in the surrounding mountains. And of course, stories tend to be exaggerated just a tad after a few rounds of drinks, so I chalked it up to that. So, when the next day rolled around, I decided to go for a little walk in the nearby woods. I wish now that I had heeded my family's initial warnings. The day started off warm and bright. The sun's rays filtered through the trees as I walked carefully along the rocky terrain. I had always felt at peace when I was amidst the beauty of nature. The smells, the sounds. It filled me with a sense of serenity. I turned toward a small creek nearby to get a drink of water when a sudden rustling in the bushes caught my attention. My heart jumped, equal parts fear and excitement. Maybe I would be the next one to uncover the identity of our local cryptid. The rustle continued, getting louder and more deliberate with each passing second. I slowly approached the source, my hands shaking from anticipation and fear. As I reached the bush, I couldn't help but think back to Uncle Lou's chilling description. Suddenly, the noise stopped. The silence that followed was so deafening, it made my ears ring. Slowly, the brush began to part. And there it was. The creature from Lou's story stood before me. It looked like nothing I'd ever seen before. It was a tangled, horrendous mix of wiry fur and mangled limbs. Did it catch my scent? Was it here for me? With that thought, an overwhelming sense of fear washed over me, and I sprinted away as fast as my legs would carry me. I could hear it behind me, huffing and snarling as it chased me through the tangled wilderness. It was in that moment I knew nobody could ever understand what it felt like to be hunted by such a monstrosity. I stumbled over roots, desperate to keep my footing. I couldn't risk falling, not when my life was on the line. The thought of ending up like whatever poor animal offered that thing sustenance was horrifying. There was nothing but sheer adrenaline coursing through my body, driving me to continue. It felt like my lungs were on fire, and I could barely even catch my breath. But I had to keep going. I had to get away. As I reached a clearing, a glimmer of hope flickered inside me. The family's cabin was just up ahead. Just a few more yards, and I would be safe. With my last ounce of strength, I closed the distance between myself and the cabin. As I reached the door, I threw myself inside and slammed it shut, locking it immediately. I gazed out of the window and saw the creature just outside the tree line. It stared at me for a moment, before releasing what had to be the most bone-chilling howl I'd ever heard. I couldn't help but shudder as I watched it disappear back into the woods. The following days were filled with tense silence as I confided my horrifying experience to my family. I knew they believed me, but I could tell they were scared too. There was no doubt in our minds that the creature had now taken an interest in our home. We spent that week in a state of heightened vigilance, sharing nightly shifts to watch the area and ensure the creature stayed at bay. We rarely spoke of the incident, and when we did, it was in hushed tones and muffled whispers. Finally, it was time for me to go back to the city, and suddenly I realized I had never been so glad to leave my childhood home. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still see the creature's twisted, haunting figure lingering in the shadows of my mind. It's been some time since that frightful encounter, and the fear still hides just behind my consciousness. The scars of that harrowing ordeal are still evident, and every night I fear the creature will come back to finish what it started. Urban life is supposed to be so safe, but I can never forget. There's always a forest not too far away. As I lie in my bed at night and listen to the distant sirens and city noises, I can't help but feel my heart race anytime a stray dog's howl echoes through the cracks in my window. And sometimes, when I'm alone in a quiet room, I swear I can still see those burning red eyes in the darkness. Story 3. I moved into the cabin by the lake a month ago. The real estate agent said it was a dream deal. The land was cheap because it had once belonged to the tribe, which meant that there was a crap ton of paperwork. It was so remote that not even the most vigilant of satellite maps could find it. But the place came with a personality. He warned me of the tales that the locals would tell about spirits and strange sightings in the woods around the cabin. At the time, I laughed. Honestly, I was even a bit excited. What a tale to tell around the campfire. Exciting stories aside, I had moved into the middle of the wilderness for one reason: to be alone with my thoughts and my art. I spent my first week just settling into the cabin and clearing the trails that lead out from it like spokes on a wheel. I spent my second week establishing a rhythm. Every morning I would hike one of the trails, breathe in the beauty that surrounded me, and let that fuel my art when I returned to the cabin. And that did it. The magic began to happen. One night, as I laid in bed with the window open, I heard a sound that was haunting and inhuman. It pierced into my dreams and woke me in a cold sweat. Grabbing the nearest weapon, a hammer that I had next to my bed, I crept out of my room and toward the open window. I peeked out and saw nothing but the still, black outline of the trees. As I closed the window, I heard a low growl, just barely on the edge of my hearing. My heart pounding, I closed and locked the door to the cabin. For the next few days, I found myself noticing everything around me. Snapped twigs or strange indents in the ground became signs of some otherworldly predator stalking around my cabin. Sometimes the hair on the back of my neck or my forearms would stand straight up. A closed-in feeling descended upon me. I knew I was being watched, but glimpsed nothing. But then something changed, and I saw it. It was just a hint of a shape against the trees, but there was movement, a shifting from black to gray. I wished that I could unsee it, could regain my sense of peace in this place, but the freedom of my heart had shattered when I realized that something was there, and not just lurking around my cabin. I continued to walk the trails each morning, but that sense of peace had been lost. That unique stillness had become something I was interrupted by strange howls and cries that haunted and chilled me. I had no choice but to bring a hunting rifle, even though I knew it wouldn't help. I was beginning to lose my mind. On the night I realized the thing had left the woods to come closer, the full moon lit up the ground. It illuminated my yard with a pale glow, casting shadows of the trees farther than they stretched in daylight. I heard a thud against the cabin. I froze, listening with my heart pounding in my ears. I tried to reason with myself. It was probably just a tree branch falling from the sheer weight of the snow that had fallen in the past week. But as I stood there, staring out through the open window at the tree line, there came a scraping sound. Claws on wood, heavy intelligent claws, dragged against the side of the cabin with a noise that made my blood curdle. With shaky hands, I grabbed my rifle and crept toward the front door. I listened first, heartbeat pounding in my ears, waiting. The scraping had stopped. The world held its breath for a moment as I took hold of the door handle. I couldn't back out now. I had to face this horror. As I opened the door, it creaked against the silence like a scream. I stepped outside the safety of my cabin and hesitated. The night was eerily still, a sudden hush hanging heavy around me. My foot crunched in the snow as I took my first step out into the yard. I could sense it now, the creature now closer than before. I trained my gun in the direction of the sound. My breathing labored as only the whites of my knuckles gripped the rifle. But the shape that was there when I first saw it, it was not there. Dread washes over me like an icy wave as I realize my worst fear. It's inside the cabin. I turn around and see the door is wide open behind me, a gaping maw inviting me back into the dark depths of what used to feel like my sanctuary. I can still hear it, drawing strangled breaths that rake its chest and send tremors through its body, muffled through the walls. Even though every voice inside me screamed at me to run as far as I could into the woods, to never look back, I had to go back. I needed to know. I needed to confront whatever monster I'd invited into my home. I crossed the threshold into the cabin, and the shadows of my once beloved and comfortable sanctuary now clamored with the whispers of the beast breathing within the darkness. The air within my cabin was heavy and bitter, no longer like a home but like a crypt. I glance around frantically, heart pounding, searching for the creature that waits for me. I needed to see it with my own eyes. But it was too late. The creature had vanished, a skill that even I, in my deepest terror, cannot comprehend or accept. Only the claw marks left carved into my front door stand as a haunting reminder of what I've faced. To sleep is to invite the horrors back. And so, I stay awake, armed and alert, waiting for the day that the darkness comes back for me. Now I hate the stillness, long for the chaos that would allow me to hide within it. I'm haunted by memories of what was, and the knowledge that the land I live on has changed me forever, as my story will change you. I often ask myself why I stay near the cabin at all. The answer lies in the pride that haunts me, as does the beast. This is my home. I will not be scared from it, and so, I share my story, offering what I must against the darkness that descends upon us all. Story 4. I ain't one for talking much, but I reckon I need to get this story off my chest before it drives me crazier than a cat in a sack full of dog teeth. It's been a few months now, and I still ain't slept right since. Hell, I don't know if I ever will. I live near Pottawatomie State Park up here in Wisconsin, pretty much in the middle of nowhere. Got neighbors, but they're a field or two away, and that suits me just fine. It all started on one of those sticky hot August nights when I felt like the sweat on the back of my neck just wouldn't dry, and the critters seemed to stop making noise. You know that kind of stillness? Like even the air up and got tired of trying to move. That's always the worst part of summer for me. So there I was, sitting out on my porch, trying to cool off a bit after busting my hump fixing fences and such all day. I was nursing an ice-cold brew and squinting up at the stars while my old dog Buck slept near my feet. Suddenly, the kind of quiet you only get when something's out of place descended on the night. Buck jerked awake and started to growl, low and dangerous. His fur stood up on end like he'd just seen the devil himself. "What's got into you, boy?" I whispered soothingly, but he had gone stone silent again. Then I heard what got him all riled up, a strange noise floating through the night. Soft at first, but gradually grew louder. It was like tires crunching on gravel, but louder, like a man crunching bones beneath his boots. In the end, I figured I'd better go take a gander. Coyotes had been getting bolder lately, and I wanted to make sure they hadn't come nosing around my property. So I grabbed my trusty pump-action shotgun and a flashlight and went down the porch steps into the muggy night, Buck trailing close. We rounded the corner of the house, and I couldn't help but to shiver despite the heat. Felt like there was a charge in the air, like an electric storm building on the horizon. I played my flashlight around the darkness and caught sight of something out of place. Something wasn't right out there, and my guts were telling me to hunker down and run, but my stubbornness won over. Now, I got a sturdy old tree smack dab in the middle of the yard, and as I got closer, I saw something was there. Not like something was near it, or under it, but something was hanging in the darn thing like a wet bedsheet. I took a deep breath, racked a shell into the chamber of my shotgun, and walked towards that tree, Buck growling and nipping at the air like he was going to bite whatever it was clean in half. As we got closer, the thing in the tree started to move. It didn't fall, like a windswept branch or something, but instead, it seemed to come alive, twisting and squirming. When I finally cast enough light on it to see, my blood ran colder than a witch's tit. There, hanging by its legs in the tree, was a thing that looked partly like a man and partly like a wolf. Worse yet, it seemed to be giving off this weird, hazy mist, like it was made of shadows and smoke, its body rippling and shifting. Now, I ain't never been one to be big on spooky stories or cryptids or whatever, but I swear on my granddaddy's grave I saw this creature with my own eyes. Its long, dark snout turned my way then, and for a heartbeat, I stared into eyes the color of fresh blood, and that lingering malice gripped my heart like a noose around my neck. I snapped out of it when Buck lunged forward, baring his teeth and barking a challenge to this creature I couldn't rightly explain. The wolf creature snarled back, and sound of it nearly froze me to the core. Before I could think twice about it, I raised my shotgun and gave that thing a taste of good old American lead. I couldn't tell if I hit it or not, but the sound of the blast seemed to shake it loose from the tree, and it fell, landing on all fours and taking off faster than grease through a goose. The way it moved, hunched over and feral, with a speed that no natural creature could match. Buck and I gave chase at first, but soon realized we weren't going to catch this thing. Its long black legs propelled it into the woods, faster than we could ever manage. I stopped at the edge of the tree line. Buck hesitated, whined, but ultimately stopped as well. "Best let that thing go, Buck," I whispered hoarsely. "Ain't no good to go following it further." With that, we retreated back to the house, and I up and locked the door for the first time in over a decade. Buck stuck close to my side as I downed another beer, my hands shaking like a tectonic fault on an overdue quake. Come morning, I found the place where that creature had hung itself in my tree. Deep gouges marred the bark, and the ground below was churned up like a plow had come through sideways. Buck sniffed around it a bit, but eventually backed away, tail tucked and teeth bared. For the next few weeks, I didn't dare sit out on my porch at night, nor let Buck roam the yard without me close by. I wasn't quite sure if the creature would return, or stick around to cause more trouble. Dark whispers echoed through the town as people spoke of strange happenings out in the woods and on the edges of their property. No one had seen it, but everyone could feel it, that eerie presence lurking just out of sight. It wasn't until one day, while I was in town picking up some supplies, that I overheard the old-timers at the diner muttering about how they hadn't seen or heard anything like it since they were young. Something about the old days, when darkness seemed to rule these woods and stories of ancient creatures whispered through the trees. One of them mentioned a shadow wolf, a kind of specter that haunted the land, transforming from wolf to man and back again, feasting on the fears of the unsuspecting. I paid closer attention and felt goosebumps prickling on my skin. Could it really be possible that such a thing existed? Now, I've never been one for superstition, but I just couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. Something unnatural, sinister, and far beyond any explanation I could understand. Since that night, the fears and whispers in town have only grown, and I've boarded up my windows, made my home into as much of a fortress as I can afford. Buck's more nervous than ever, his barks at night turning into nervous whines. People come to me now and ask me if I've seen anything, that damned encounter making me some kind of expert on this shadow wolf or whatever it is. And as crazy as everyone thinks I might be, I can't forget those eyes I looked into, that unnatural feeling that pressed down on my chest, and the malicious grin on its wolfish muzzle. I know it's still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment. All I can do is keep my wits about me and keep my shotgun close. I'm done trying to figure out what it is or where it comes from. I hope I never set eyes on it again, for my sake and for everyone else's. But if it ever does come back, I'll be ready. And I pray that everyone who wanders through these woods and experiences that unsettling voice, that icy stillness deep down inside them, heeds my warning. Beware of the shadow wolf, for it knows your fear. Story 5. I've always been a city girl. Born and raised in the concrete jungle, I thought I knew it all. I've roamed New York streets at 3 a.m., stumbling from one bar to another, feeling invincible and untouchable. When something scary or unsettling happened, it was never anything supernatural. Just the ugly side of humanity rearing its head. Muggers, drunks, addicts. It's strange how the primal part of you always knows the difference. It only took one weekend away in the woods for me to realize that. My friend Maya said it would be a great idea if we had a girls' weekend away at her aunt's cabin. She wanted to do some bonding, some hiking, maybe roast some marshmallows. Cheesy as hell, sure. But I had a soft spot for Maya, so I agreed to come along. There were 5 of us in total, 2 I knew, and 2 were friends of Maya's from college. The drive to Maya's cabin was long and tedious, a 6-hour journey from the city, where the woods began to close in around us as we ventured forward. The sun sank lower in the sky, and as we turned the final stretch of the journey, all civilization seemed to disappear. The weather wasn't on our side either. It rained non-stop, turning the road into a muddy mess. It seemed like all the elements were conspiring to keep people away from this place. Finally, we arrived at the cabin, isolated and quaint, situated in a clearing surrounded by a dense wall of trees. We unloaded our bags from the car and went inside, trying to shake off the cold and the unsettling feeling that had settled on all of us. The first day, everything went smoothly, despite the persistent rain and eerie backdrop. We cooked dinner together, played board games, and drank wine until we were all laughing and feeling a bit tipsy. I almost forgot where we were, but the peace I felt was short-lived. The next day, as we were hiking through the woods, I noticed something strange. Not too far from us, there stood a figure, half hidden behind a tree. Tall and gaunt, with pale skin and dark, lifeless eyes. It seemed to be watching us intently. My heart raced, but I didn't mention it to the others. Maybe I'd had too much wine last night, and my imagination was getting the better of me. That night, I forced myself to go to sleep. I tried to ignore the nagging, unsettling feeling that the figure I had seen was something beyond an ordinary person. Something wrong. Something frightening. Things only got worse from there. The figure was somehow always present, lurking just out of sight. I felt as if everything it did was calculated, always keeping an eye on us. The more I saw of it, the more I couldn't shake the idea that it was not human. "What is it, Sam?" Maya asked me on the third day, when she saw the worry etched across my face as I scanned the woods for any sign of the figure. I don't know. I couldn't bring myself to tell her what I had seen. I didn't want her to think I was losing my mind. I think we should leave this place earlier than planned. Maya looked concerned, but she promised me we'd cut the trip short if that's what I wanted. That night, the storm outside reached its peak. The wind blew fiercely and rain pelted the cabin, making it impossible to sleep. As I lay in bed, nerves frayed, every unnatural sound seemed to be amplified. The faint scratching of something at my window, distant whispering, and a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from the woods. I knew whatever I was experiencing was no ordinary human threat. I felt an icy terror grip my heart. The primal part of me knew I was dealing with a predator that wanted to pick us off one by one. I couldn't allow that to happen. I gathered everyone around and finally told them everything. The relief was immediate. They had all felt something was off as well, though no one could describe precisely what they had sensed. We agreed to leave as soon as the storm subsided. As dawn approached, the storm died down, and we started packing our bags, eager to leave this cursed place behind. But the figure I had seen was relentless. It didn't want to let us go without a struggle. Just as we were about to lock the cabin and leave, we heard someone calling our names. It sounded uncannily like Maya's aunt, as if she were outside, lost in the woods and desperately needing our help. We looked at each other in abject terror. There was no way her aunt could be here. Was the figure mimicking voices to lure us to our doom? We bolted to the car, refusing to fall for the creature's sick game. We knew deep down that if we went into those woods, we would never come back out. The car had barely started when the figure emerged from the woods, bearing down on us with a terrifying speed that couldn't be humanly possible. It was tall, skinny, and moved in ways that didn't seem natural, its limbs twisted and disjointed as it sprinted towards the car. I floored the gas pedal, the tires screeching against the pavement as we left the figure behind. We couldn't ignore what had happened, how the creature had tormented us, hunted us, and tried to lure us into its lair. But it was over. We had survived. I've never set foot in the woods again after that nightmare of a weekend. The images of that creature haunt me to this day. And although I can't prove what it was, I know deep down that we faced something sinister, something ancient and malevolent that lurked at the edge of humanity's understanding. The feeling was raw and primal, a fear that our ancestors surely felt when they gathered around the nighttime fires, hoping that the light would be enough to keep the unspeakable horrors at bay. The city may be my home, full of all its dangers and complexities, but now, every time I look into the dark depths of a forest, I remember that there are far worse things hiding in those shadows, and I count myself lucky to have escaped with my life that weekend. Story 6. I used to work part-time as a forest ranger in the backwoods of northern Montana. I ain't gonna lie, it was pretty good living out in those woods. Between earning a couple of bucks and learning from some of the older rangers, I had some of the best adventures a man could ask for. That was until that fateful Sunday, one which continued to haunt me for years. The air felt heavy and cold as I made my way into the station. Old Tom, a grizzled ranger vet, handed me the list of duties for the next week. I glanced down to see what I'd be doing for the coming days. And that's when I saw it. Cabin duty. It stood out like bad news. "Aw, hell, Tom," I muttered. "You sure I gotta do this?" Old Tom chuckled. "You can't hog all the good jobs, boy. Now get on with it." I couldn't really argue with that, so I asked him for any advice about dealing with the week-long cabin assignment. Tom's eyes became somber, and he leaned in close to my ear. "Boy, you listen here. Stay away from the old Cooper place. Folks say it's haunted by something." Now I knew Tom enjoyed scaring us young guys by telling stories about strange happenings and mysterious critters. But this time, his warning had a weight to it, like he wasn't pulling my leg. I nodded silently and set out for my week in the wilderness. The Cooper place was an old, abandoned cabin that sat on a neglected chunk of land, surrounded by tall trees and thick undergrowth. The thing was, nobody had lived there for years. Not since Old Man Cooper went missing one day, never to return. Locals didn't talk about what happened, but avoided the place like the plague. Despite the warning, the first 2 nights were uneventful. As I settled down in my own cabin on the 3rd night, I noticed the air was even colder than before. Shadows seemed to stretch longer, like grasping fingers in the moonlight. Around midnight, I was awoken by a persistent scratching noise from outside my window. Sleepy yet curious, I peeked out between the blinds and saw nothing but darkness. Deciding it was just a raccoon or some other critter, I crawled back to bed and pulled the covers over myself, dozing back to sleep. I awoke after daybreak with the scratching sound still in my head. I decided to investigate around my cabin, just to ease my mind. But as I circled around the back, my blood ran cold. Instead of finding small claw marks left by a raccoon, I saw huge, jagged scratches on the wood, deep enough to carve right through the paint. The marks didn't belong to any animal I'd seen or encountered. Unease settled in, but I shook it off, resolved to finish my duty. A part of me wondered if this was just another one of Tom's tricks. I went about my work, trying to forget about the strange scratches, but kept my gun close to my side. The following day, I nervously approached a fellow ranger, Greg, to ask if he'd heard anything strange the prior night. Greg, a talkative guy with a good sense of humor, frowned and shook his head. I decided to confide in him, and reluctantly recounted what I saw. The atmosphere shifted as Greg became all too serious. "Listen, man," Greg whispered. "Tom told me the same thing he told you. If I was you, I wouldn't stay at that cabin for the rest of the week. Old Man Cooper didn't just vanish. Folks claim something took him, something unnatural." With Greg's words weighing heavy on me, I left our conversation feeling more anxious than ever. That 4th night, I skipped dinner, hunkering down in my cabin with my back against the door. My eyes darted around the room, my gun cradled in my lap, and ears straining to catch any sound. Then it came. The scratching. Louder and more desperate than before, the sound of claws tearing into wood reverberated through the cold night air. I gathered my courage and pulled my gun, making my way toward the window. As I peered out, the sight nearly froze me in terror. It wasn't some wild animal that stood there, but a twisted, monstrous creature straight out of a nightmare. Its dark, leathery skin clung to its skeletal frame, and about its face were jagged, hollow eye sockets. Atop its ghastly skull were long, twisted horns that seemed to belong to some ancient, mythical beast. My breath caught in my throat as its humanoid hands, tipped with wicked, razor-sharp claws, tore into the cabin wall. Reality snapped me out of fear, and I raised my gun, firing off a round at the creature. The impact did little more than briefly interrupt the scratching, sending the monster into a rage. It shrieked, raising its head to reveal gaping, endless darkness where its mouth should have been. It charged straight toward the cabin. Thinking quickly, I tilted a nearby cabinet against the door before bolting to the radio. I called Greg for backup, praying he'd make it in time. I retreated into the bedroom, clutching my gun, and praying to God that the creature outside wouldn't break in. Seconds felt like hours as the scratching turned into pounding against the barricaded door. I held my gun tight, sweat dripping down my forehead, knees quivering with fear. Just when I thought all hope was lost, I heard the distant sound of gunfire and the beast's blood-curdling screams. Moments later, Greg burst into the room, wild-eyed and pale. "We gotta get out of here now!" he shouted, grabbing hold of me, fear finally giving way to action. We sprinted into the night, leaving all our belongings behind, until we reached Greg's truck. Slamming the door shut, he floored the pedal, kicking up dirt as we sped away from the cabin, neither of us daring to look back at the hellspawn that haunted our steps. The drive seemed endless, but eventually we returned to the station, shivering, gasping, and more alive than we'd ever felt. Tom was waiting for us, a mix of relief and sadness evident in his weary eyes. I was about to pour out my thanks when he held up a hand. "I knew I should have told you more," Tom sighed, "but I didn't want to scare you away. Maybe that thing wouldn't have found you if I hadn't given it reason to." The week-long cabin duty was permanently removed from the list of ranger duties. and many folks speculated about the unearthly creature that prowled the woods. In the following years, more unexplained events occurred, luring in hunters and curious thrill-seekers alike. As for me, I moved on from my time as a forest ranger, carrying the harrowing memory of that night like a scar. Though I never encountered the creature again, there were still countless nights in which its howls echoed in my dreams, reminding me of the unfailing truth that some things are better left unseen. My time in northern Montana taught me many things, but one realization endures above all others: the chilling fact that monsters don't just exist in campfire tales or in the pages of fiction. They're out there, lurking in the shadows of unexplored woods and forgotten cabin hideaways, waiting for us to cross the boundary between the comforting, mundane world we know and the terrifying reality of what lies beyond.